The Republic of the Congo votes in presidential elections on Sunday, with the incumbent Denis Sassou Nguesso aiming to extend his decades-long hold on power in the Central African state. Nguesso has accumulated 36 years in office and was most recently re-elected in 2016, after which the opposition was effectively sidelined. His two main rivals were sentenced to 20 years in prison, leaving no major figures in opposition to challenge him. The 77-year-old retired paratrooper appears favored to win a fourth term in Sunday's ballot. Now, the largest opposition group in the country, the Pan-African Union for Social Democracy, is boycotting the vote. Joining me now to chat around this is Daniel van Dalen. He's a country risk analyst. Daniel, a pleasure to have you on the program this afternoon. Now, the incumbent Denis Sassou Nguesso is aiming to extend his decades-long hold on power in the Central African state. What can you tell us about his tenure?
Hi there, yes. Thank you so much for having me this afternoon, and good afternoon to your viewers. Obviously, we've seen a bit of a more militarized approach, especially in the 2016 election, and that's, I suppose one could argue, that has come to define his tenure as president. We've even just seen now, with clandestine weapon shipments coming through, I think, the militarized approach to his rule is quite a defining one. I think they also are preparing for something potentially what we saw in 2016 with, post-election violence. And as we said, as you said, the two opposition leaders were arrested. And I think that also defines it, where the opposition space is so limited in the country. So in addition to the prominent opposition parties boycotting the ballot, even the smaller parties have faced acts of repression ahead of the ballot as well. So I think a more militarized rule and a highly repressed socio-political environment has come to define his tenure thus far, for all 36 years.
Yeah, I actually want us to expand a bit on that now. So Sassou Nguesso, like you say, has accumulated about 36 years in office, and most recently he was re-elected back in 2016. His tenure has seen the opposition effectively sidelined, and his two main rivals were sentenced to about 20 years for forced labor. What can you tell us about the man that is Sassou Nguesso?
Well, I think he's a bit of a showman. I don't know if you've ever seen any of his campaigns, how he stands on the top of his vehicle. I think at the end of the day, the man enjoys being in power. He enjoys being head of state. We saw, obviously, when they moved to amend the constitution in 2015 to effectively change the term limits, to remove the age limits and effectively allow him to run obviously in 2016 again, this year, and potentially in the next ballot as well. So yeah, I think at the end of the day, as we've said before, in a more repressive socio-political environment, the man enjoys to stay in power versus fostering a more democratic environment in the Republic of Congo. And I think, unfortunately, that is going to come to define this election as well, with no apparent opposition to contest. And like I said, I think we've obviously seen the main opposition party refuse to participate, but I even think if they attempted to, we would see a very similar environment of clamping down and Sassou Nguesso attempting to control power by all means possible, versus, again, fostering a more democratic system of elections. And that's also, you can see it in the fact that the voters' roll hasn't been updated. A census hasn't been undertaken in the country since 2007. There are concerns about the military double voting because they voted on the 17th of March. So I think, as we said, in addition to just the militarized component, the man enjoys to stay in power, and he's done all that is possible to create that environment in the current election.
I mean, this sounds quite worrying. It doesn't sound like this country is a functional democracy. I mean, when looking at Sassou Nguesso, he hopes for a first-round victory over 7 challenges. Now, this including the former finance minister, Matthias Zon, who was a runner-up back in 2016. Now, in your opinion, surely this is just going to be a landslide victory for Nguesso?
I think it's a bit of an interesting dynamic this year, because you mentioned the former finance minister, but from what I've seen, especially from the campaigns that have taken over in the past 2-3 weeks, Guy Bryce Colelas, who actually was the second runner-up in the 2016 ballot, has seemed to accumulated quite a bit of popular support in the country. So I think it'll be a bit of an interesting spread to who the population decides to vote for in terms of the opposition. I personally think that Guy Bryce Colelas will be runner-up again. And then I think we'll see a similar situation that we saw in 2016, where you have two relatively popular opposition figures, both accumulating between 13 and 15%, and then Denis Sassou Nguesso then coming in with 60% and winning the first round. So absolutely, I think we'll see a very similar outcome to what we saw in 2016. I think Guy Bryce Colelas might potentially do a little bit better than we saw in 2016. He's really pushed forward for the campaigning. I do know that some other opposition parties have put forward their support for him. But like you said, we'll see the former finance minister definitely take some votes away from him. So I don't think there are any opposition figures that have the capability of crossing that 50% threshold required to win a first round. And I don't think that in combination, any of the oppositions could basically prevent Sassou Nguesso from doing so as well. So as you said, I think we'll be seeing a relative landslide victory tomorrow.
I want us to zoom a bit into the state of the country right now. I mean, this is a former French colony, and it's also been hit hard by cycles of falling world crude prices. And it's also hobbled by corruption and poor infrastructure. What opportunities lie in that country, and what would you say is hindering its development?
So I think there's actually some positive stuff going forward. I personally think if you just look in the past 2 years, I think prior to 2019, corruption was rampant. I think there was just not enough investment into, obviously, their mainstay oil sector, which accounts for the most of their budget, their receipts, their GDP. So their dependent sector, there was not much investment. Their state-owned oil company, there's a lot of liabilities held, a lot of debt. But my understanding is that the IMF have come forward and said, if you want assistance, you will have to meet the following objectives, and that includes stamping out corruption. So we have seen in the past couple of months, in fact the past year, several mid-tier government officials go to jail quite quickly. We've also seen a lot of debt restructuring talks. We saw in 2020 Republic of Congo's debt reach 100% of GDP, while with the debt restructuring that we're anticipating in the coming year, it could potentially drop down to 80%, but it's still dramatically unsustainable. So I think right now, in terms of opportunities, investor sentiment remains quite mixed, specifically because you do have a country where corruption is rampant despite the measures that have been taken thus far. You still have debt concerns. You still have mismanagement of the state-owned oil firm. That said, I think in the coming years, and unfortunately, Denis Sassou Nguesso will provide some stability in pursuing these policy objectives. As much as we say, there's not necessarily a democratic foundation in the country, I think any shift in the political landscape at the moment would potentially hinder reaching these objectives, because the government has actually been quite consistent, or relatively consistent, in trying to meet these objectives in order to, first off, obviously drop their debt, increase investment into their mainstay oil sector, and then obviously trying to get further disbursements from the World Bank and the IMF, who have basically said no at this point until you sort these issues out. So I think right now, the country is obviously, the economy is flagging slightly, well, not slightly, quite significantly, especially after last year where we saw a 7% GDP drop or contraction. So yeah, I think unfortunately Nguesso is the man to push it forward, at least for now, until they meet these objectives. But I think we will only see any sort of resumption or positive prosperity in the country, at least in the next 3-4 years versus in the immediate term.
Well, Daniel, thank you very much for your time. That was Daniel van Dalen. He's a country risk analyst speaking to us about those elections set to take place in the Republic of the Congo tomorrow.